Welcome, everybody. It's now 2 minutes past the hour, so I think it's okay for us to start. I am really thrilled to have so many of you joining the call from all sorts of different time zones. So I should say good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever it is that we might find you at this hour. My name is Alina Rocha Menocal, and I am the director of the Thinking and Working Politically Community of Practice, hosted at the University of Birmingham. And I should say that this is a recorded conversation. So my colleague Tandy will do me the favor of muting people so that we can hear each other. Today, we're being brought together for what promises to be a very exciting conversation that is being hosted by the Thinking Working Politically Community of Practice on monitoring and evaluation in the Thinking Working Politically space, and how we can tell stories or how we can tell if efforts to promote change through this kind of politically informed lens are making a difference and are working. I am truly delighted that we have two thought leaders in this field who will be facilitating this conversation for us today, Tom Aston and Flor Guerzovich. They may be known to a lot of you, so they probably don't need an introduction, but just to say that they really have been at the forefront of efforts to think about how to monitor, evaluate, and learn from efforts that are anchored in thinking and working politically principles in very complex settings. And in combination, the two of them really bring decades of experience working with all sorts of actors at the local, national, and international level, with domestic actors, international actors, and all kinds of different organizations around the world on this very point. So I really want to thank them both for convening this space for us today, beginning from conceptualizing what we wanted to talk about and taking care of every detail to ensure that we are here today in what promises to be a very rich and insightful discussion, and with such an amazing array of actors and interested individuals from across the globe. As I said earlier, it's really fun to see people checking in and to recognize names from the past, not the too long past, the recent past, the present, and hopefully the future. So it's really wonderful. Before I turn over proceedings to the two of them, though, let me just say a few words about the Thinking Working Politically Community of Practice for those of you who may be less familiar with it. And my colleague Tandy will be doing the favor of posting all sorts of links in the chat for you so that you can get more information. But as hopefully many of you are aware, the Thinking and Working Politically Community of Practice, which has also a very it's anchored at the University of Birmingham, but it has a very active group in Washington, DC as well, is a diverse and growing global network of practitioners and researchers in development and global affairs who are committed to promoting more effective policy and practice. And our network includes all sorts of people with extensive expertise working in or with the research community, civil society organizations, donor agencies, and implementing partners.
A really interesting, oh my God, I hope they can't.
The TWP Community of Practice has a global webinar series, of which this is one iteration. And the webinar series was launched in 2022 to convene these kinds of conversations on topics and debates that we really need to get a grapple on to be able to move forward with thinking, working politically. And we have done this in collaboration with all sorts of partners, including individuals like Tom and Flor, but also organizations from the FCDO here in the UK to USAID, to the Asia Foundation, what have you. So please do take a look at our website for more information. And if you have not already, also make sure that you sign up to our newsletter, which is on Substack, and hopefully Tandy can put the link in the chat for all of you, where we try to update you on all sorts of interesting things on a bi-monthly basis, meaning once every 2 months or so, on exciting things that are happening, and also with a lot of exciting original content. In addition to all of this, and briefly before I turn to our facilitators, if for any reason you encounter tech issues and you need help, please do send us an email at the TWP COP address that Tandy will be posting on the chat, and we will try to help you as quickly as we can. Without further ado, I want to, another thing that I wanted to mention before I turn proceedings over is that we are also trying to get a sense of how the community of practice can be most helpful to all of the different people who are involved with it in one way or another, or look to it for support and guidance on the kinds of work that you might be doing. So it would be very helpful for us if you can help us, if you have time, not now, but during the course of the next 2 hours or so, if you can help us fill out a survey that we have, where we just have some very basic questions for you, with the hope that we can get feedback, and then from there learn, so that we can also become a more supportive network. Okay, now without further ado, I really want to thank again Tom and Flor, and to say muchísimas gracias a ambos for facilitating this session. And this is my first fishbowl experience ever, so I'm looking forward to seeing what it feels like. Thank you, and now over to you guys.
Hi everyone, thank you Alina for the invite to try pulling this off. We'll see how it works. Before we start, just a reminder for everyone to mute yourselves while you're not speaking. We're super excited because of the diversity of colleagues that have joined this call. And we want to talk today about the future of monitoring and evaluating in TWP. We really wanted to bring together people that are experimenting, that are doing work at the juncture of M&E and thinking and working politically, to talk about what that looks like in practice, what it is like to move beyond just counting the number of political economy reports that one commissions as what it looks like to M&E PA, to trying to think of what is the contribution of a political economy lens in the work. Our starting point is that this is not just a methodological challenge, but one that requires connecting different operational realities and also different crowds. And so it's great to see in this virtual room these crowds, these different crowds. We are experimenting with the methodology of this conversation. We didn't want presentations. We wanted to combine a little bit of a fishbowl type dynamic, where we've asked a few colleagues to help us kick off the conversations, and then we will be able to open it up to others that might raise their hands. But it may also feel a little bit like speed dating, because we have a lot of ground to cover and a lot of different experiences. So it's going to be a taster, so to speak, of different approaches and viewpoints. For those that may want to join the conversation as we move forward, just raise your hand or put your question, your comment in the chat, and Tandy and Alina are going to help us monitor the conversation and try to bring other voices. We have 4 rounds of questions that we've set out, and hopefully we'll be able to cover all of those, and if not, I'm sure this will be somehow continued. And with that, I'll pass it on to Tom to get us started.
Thanks, Flor, and lovely to see everyone here. Great mix of people I can see on my screen. As Flor says, we divided the session into 4 chunks, essentially. And the aim is to have 10 to 15 minutes for each of these, essentially. So for the first one, we just wanted to start fairly broad and just get a sense of what we're talking about from a few colleagues. So as Flor says, there's a few people we wanted to call upon to give us a bit of a taste, a bit of a sense. I wanted to start, if I can, with UNDP. I can see Soren Haldrup is with us, so I'm going to call him in just a second. But basically, we have a guiding question in this case, which is, what kinds of stories can we tell about how thinking, working politically approaches have contributed to change? And part of what we're looking for here is, okay, how is this different? In what way is this potentially different from just collaborating, learning, and adapting, or adaptive management in general? So I wanted to see if I could call on maybe Soren to kick us off, because he's been doing lots of great work at UNDP, to give a sense of his take on this and how this is potentially different. And then I'll call on a few more colleagues after Soren. Soren, if you can hear us.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Tom and Flo, for convening this space. It's great to see a lot of past colleagues and friends and people on this call. So thank you again for convening it. It's a really good question. I think taking a step back, I think first of all, just reflecting a bit on something Flo said of I think there's a risk of this political economy analysis becoming another kind of box ticking exercise. You do the report because you wrote that in your project document. You're not necessarily using the insights in it. So I think moving from this regular political economy analysis towards really just thinking and working politically, I think is a really important shift in moving from delivering products to just kind of reflecting this in your day-to-day work. I've seen this play out back when I was at Oxford Policy Management. OPM was managing a big extractive industries transparency initiative in Nigeria called Foster, and the evolution of that program sort of reflected a bit this shift where initially there was sort of these regular PA reports. A consultant would come in and write these, and the donor differed, like these, because a lot of interesting insights, but it didn't necessarily find its way into the day-to-day working of the team managing that program. And over time, that sort of evolved from not really doing these regular reports to just having a much more kind of entrepreneurial way of working in the team, just kind of keeping in touch with contacts and just kind of having huddles now and then, and this just kind of unstructured flow of information in the team, I think, was something that really reflected a better way of working politically than through these regular PA political economy analysis. I think maybe just one last reflection, and this is sort of maybe slightly outside of it. I think there's also an element of recognizing the uncertainty and unpredictability of the context you're working in. There's a risk of learning too fast and failing and ending activities because you feel these are not going anywhere. One example from this Foster initiative was the team was doing a lot of work and a lot of support around the petroleum industry bill in Parliament and so on. And had they learned really fast, then they would have ended that because it didn't go anywhere for years. But all of a sudden, there was a change in the political context, and there was momentum. And because of that, the team was really well placed to come in and support. And I think that's just an interesting reflection of how little we know about how things can change, and things we think might not be successful might actually be successful later on. That was a bit unstructured, but hopefully somewhat useful.
That's
Thanks,
great,
Tom
Soren.
and Flo.
Thanks for that. I'm going to see if I can pass on now to Drew Koleros, who's at Mathematica, and I know he has lots of previous experience, including in Nigeria as well. There's lots of colleagues I can see on the screen from previous programming there. But Drew, could I ask you the same question, just to give us a sense for a couple of minutes of a little nugget or a little vignette of how you've approached this more recently in your work?
Yeah, sounds good. Thanks, Tom. And hey, everybody, good to see some familiar faces and meet some new folks as well. Kind of building a bit on what Soren is talking about a little bit around this kind of notion about, the standalone political economy report that sort of sits on a shelf, and where I've seen my work take me as more of the applied political economy, but specifically from a systems change perspective. So do a lot of work around systems change and systems change evaluation. and taking an applied political economy approach, working politically within understanding how systems are currently working and how they might shift in the future has been really useful for me. So some of the work that we've been doing most recently is understanding current system dynamics. So we're thinking about the actors and the relationships between them, and then taking more political economy approaches to understand power dynamics between those, or how mental models are driving motivations and some of the wider formal and informal rules that are driving the core norms within these actor groups. That gives us a nice entry point to understand how different types of funded partners or grantees could be trying to shift the system in different ways. And from that systems framing, then we can start to talk a little bit about causal pathways, about how different entry points within a system are meant to contribute to a wider systems change. That can give us a nice base for thinking about hypotheses to test, how we might be able to understand how change is happening. But specifically in reporting that out, it gives us a context-specific lens to be looking at that, where we're really looking at signs of systems change as opposed to counting up instances of policy changes or numbers of this or number of that and trying to aggregate those out, but being able to use those entry points to understand how systems are changing structurally, relationally, transformational changes, and those context-specific stories about what those look like and how different funded partners or different grantees are contributing to that change. So when I've started to really integrate TWP approaches into my systems mapping work, both at the beginning and looking backwards at the end, I found that it to be a really rich lens for being able to tell these more context-specific stories.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Drew, for sharing. That's great. I'm going to quickly pass on, if I may, to some colleagues at RTI. I think we have Ava Matsiko and Sarah Fraser with us. I'm not sure if one of you might want to share your reflections on a recent case you've had. I understand that there's also a competition on TWP. So I wonder if you can shed any light on in what way is this different from just collaborating, learning, and adapting? How have you framed this differently? How do you see this differently? I'd really like to hear from you. Thanks.
Yes, so I'll speak briefly about the competition, and Sarah will talk about the differences. In terms of it was a USAID call for practitioners and I think mission staff to reflect on where they have used TWP in a real case scenario, and reflect on that. You know, it was a very guided questionnaire. What was the issue? What was the context? What made you think about TWP? How did you apply it? How did you apply your PA process? What were the outcomes? Did you bring in any external actors? What resulted? What did you learn from the process? And I think we in our case applied it to an institution we were working with directly, and we were implementing stuff in country. And I think reflecting on what has been said so far, the value of doing PA with staff who are actually implementing increases so much more the probability of utilizing the findings, because they on a day-to-day basis are engaging with these partners, and on a day-to-day basis see opportunities and entry points to apply the findings. So that was a similar situation in which we applied, and so that was the competition. And I think I'll just turn over to Sarah to talk about, you know, how the case competition was different, or has similarities or differences with CLA approaches. Sarah?
Thanks, Eva. Yes, RTI has applied to the TWP competition this past year and was a finalist, and then many years to the CLA competition. And I think I think they're related. I think when done well, TWP involves collaborating with stakeholders, focused learning, and adapting in response to the evidence. I think TWP is kind of a deeper version of a CLA approach. It really is exploring why change is or is not occurring, stakeholder perspectives on incentives, and why certain people block change or support change. And unlike other possible CLA approaches, I think TWP is particularly useful when operating in complex environments or systems, or when we need to dig beneath the surface beyond technical reasons to really explore barriers to success. One thing that I think really excites me about the TWP competition is its potential to seed more TWP in programming. If you look at the CLA case competition over the past 10 years, the number of cases submitted every year, but also the quality of the cases and the level of depth of the CLA approaches has continued to increase since the 10 years of the competition. So I think this first TWP competition celebrated TWP successes as well as lessons learned, and I think it will continue to contribute to greater TWP uptake.
Many thanks, many thanks, Sarah. One more group here that I think we have is creative, and I think, if I'm not mistaken, we should have Lisa and Dr. Tuan. Not sure if you could share some of your experiences with the Learn initiative in Nigeria. What's your take on this?
Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, colleagues. In Nigeria, we make use of the thinking and working politically to champion result-based financing with government institution, UBEC. UBEC is saddled with management of basic education, and the creative USAID Learn to Read project focused on P1 and P2 early grade reading reform, which is under the basic education. Our entry point was a kind of political institution analysis of UBEC environment, knowing from the background that UBEC participated in BESDA. BESDA is a World Bank payment for results model, and we try to x-ray what works and what does not work during BESDA with UBEC, so that we can use this experience to have a refined model on this payment for results for early grade reading reform in Nigeria. And not only that, we try to contextualize and understand the UBEC working environment in terms of existing department in UBEC that has related mandate to early grade reading reform, so that we can collaborate and work with this department to co-create and co-design all the modalities involved in designing the result-based financing model for UBEC. Then in designing, like I've said, it will involve a lot of coordination and meeting, a lot of interactive process, looking into some more information, existing opportunities, so that we can arrive at a kind of model that we align to the National Reading Framework, which is a policy document that the federal government of Nigeria endorsed with the support of USAID Learn to Read project to drive early grade reading reform in Nigeria. In this policy document, there are 10 commitments, and UBEC agreed to champion 4 out of the 10 commitments to incentivize states that can show evidence results in promoting early grade reading reform in their respective states. So this informs what goes into our foundational DLIs, the scalable DLIs, and the outcome DLIs. And I must say that it was first of its kind in Nigeria as a country to have an indigenous and domestic payment for result financing by UBEC Commission, because all other payment for result-based financing has been donor-driven, most especially World Bank-driven. But this time around, UBEC, from its own consolidated federal revenue, allocated 800 million to champion this sport and pilot it in 13 states, so that by the time the outcome results MVC, they can do a kind of scale up after the project. So the good thing we were doing now is working with the technical working group, and that is the aspect of the TWG again, because they are the driver's seat, and we co-drive with them by giving them the needed technical assistance support. And as I speak now, they are at the field doing a verification exercise for the disbursement of the foundational DLIs in the 13 pilot states for UBEC. So this was actually informed us in participating in this USAID Thinking and Working Politically case studies to showcase what Nigeria is doing and the first kind of indigenous support to promote early grade reading reform, not donor-driven funding, but from the federal government consolidated to change government, state government responsiveness and change their attitude to reward systems so that if you are able to demonstrate results, definitely you'll be incentivized based on the criteria and based on the disbursement linked indicators that we have agreed among ourselves to drive with the state partners. So another thing, what I would say about the CLA and TLP, to me, is not all that different. There exists a symbiotic relationship because the success of TWP inform CLA because we are working with 13 states and already the 13 state coordinating directors are sharing experiences among themselves, which is a collaborative learning adaptive now that we are seeing, a kind of synergy. Okay, Lagos State, what are you doing? What do we need to do differently in our state? All this is ongoing now. It's like a good, positive competition and healthy rivalry. Oh, we don't want to miss this opportunity. We want to key into this. Tell us how to go about it. So for me, if there are kind of differences, I see a symbiotic relationship between thinking and working politically and collaborative learning adaptiveness. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a helpful clarification for some of the comments in the chat as well. And I think you've also touched on another comment about how donor driven this is or isn't or should be and shouldn't. And I've got colleagues or ex-colleagues from the Pearl program here who might also have some thoughts on payment by results. We had some battle scars, I think would be one way of putting it. So it's interesting to see within the same country, there's been a different approach potentially taken. So we'll hear a little bit more from those colleagues now. What we wanted to do, because obviously we've got lots of cases we're trying to sort of drip feed the group, is pass on to the next question. And after the next question, we're going to open up a little broader for commentary. So we're not trying to open up just yet, but the aim will be to do so after this next question. So I'm going to hand back to Flor now for the next leading question that we have. Oh no, sorry, I've got I'm going to hand back to Flor now. That's right.
So I think part of the exercise here is to understand, it's challenging to monitor and evaluate what the contribution of thinking and working politically is. And so one of the things we wanted to take advantage of the fact that USAID had this competition and a lot of different cases emerge, to use it as a way to illustrate how colleagues that answered the challenge, but also colleagues that looked into all those diverse experiences, establish what were priority outcomes or reasonable levels of contribution in different contexts. So I wanted to invite David Jacobstein from USAID to give us his take after having gone through all those cases that came through the competition.
Thanks very much, Flora and Tom, and thanks for inviting me. Yeah, it was really fascinating to see as with any case competition, I think, as we can see from the chat, more people could have heard about it than did. So I think there are many more examples, but it was great to have a number of opportunities to review what people were putting forward as thinking, working politically, and kind of consider that. We also have done some research on our solicitations, and in both cases kind of had to put together kind of rubrics to think about what we are looking for, what does this translate to in practice, which I think was very helpful in pushing beyond the formal side of, rooted things in a political economy analysis or understanding, and kind of getting at what that looks like in practice and working. I think it really was about, I think, surfacing some of the theory of change and whether the kind of theory of the problem really was rooted in power dynamics. I think there was some attention to learning over time, which I imagine is of interest for an MEL audience, that you know, were folks looking at past efforts and kind of using that to develop their understanding of the rules of the game and what will work in this context. You know, were they looking for positive deviance and kind of outliers and how to draw that in to kind of incorporate lessons from there? So I think there was a lot that was kind of good to see, particularly because we expected perhaps that this would mostly be in the democracy, human rights, and governance sector. That's where most of the TWP team sits in USAID. But actually, we got a lot of submissions from different sectors, and this seems like something that was, you know, we've always believed in theory, but in practice also seems like it could be applied, you know, agnostically to sector, and really was just a question of looking at why change was going to happen and how the work was going to make change likelier, which I think can be broadly understood. So it was really interesting to look at kind of having to answer the question, how are you going to grade these things? What does it look like if somebody is thinking and working politically? How do you expect them to document evidence that shaped what they did? And really looking not just at kind of questions of learning, but questions of how learning was applied and almost how the MEL boundary was made less from the technical work, and how that kind of scan of the environment and understanding of where opportunities were coming was core to the work rather than kind of just a feedback loop around technically directed work. So I'll stop there, but I think it was really interesting to look at, and there was a lot to unpack, and I hope people do read through the submissions, and that when we do the next one that people will submit to that as well.
Thank you, David. I wanted to call on Alex Watson, who's an independent consultant and has done work with me and with Tom for the World Bank and others, to reflect on another rubric that was used to look at functionally about what contribution looks like in different contexts, and how to set those reasonable levels of achievement, how to think about those.
Hi, everyone. Hi. Yeah, thanks, Flora. Yeah, Flora and I were thinking about this in our work together with the GPSA, just as a way to frame this problem we were seeing of like how there's often an inclination to go from like 0 to all or nothing, kind of like, you know, maybe starting from scratch in a program that's being piloted, to expecting that in 3 years there would be scaling by others. And we felt that wasn't happening in reality, but also there must be something in between. Like, what are the steps in between that also count for outcomes, and what are early signs? So the rubric we developed helped us set that framework, and not that it's happening the exact same way in every context or that it will be linear. There's often starts and stops. But in looking at that kind of causal pathway, if we start from a point where, if you're evaluating it, you know, at the end, or trying to start it from the beginning, you know, starting from that there's no evidence of any sort of interest or likelihood for scale or uptake for, you know, the steps we found were like, the next one would be that there's some kind of interest being generated by the project or the intervention with key stakeholders in that system who can influence and find entry points for adoption on the program. And, you know, another step beyond that would be, is there an outcome where we found evidence that there were those entry points identified, and that different key actors, like say government officials in an education program, and other funders and NGOs and community actors working in education, were actually looking at where those entry points were, you know, where could it fit after the project? And then moving beyond that, was there kind of sustained dialogue throughout a program in making that happen, not just in implementing the program and handing it over at the end or sharing the evidence of success, but was there, you know, sustained engagement where dialogue about how it could continue, in what form, an adapted form as it should, beyond, say, a 3-year time period. And at the kind of 6, sorry, I'm just hearing, at the point of, you know, maybe an end of the program, often we're not going to see wholesale uptake, but we might see a situation where there's a some kind of concrete action taken by another actor or a group of actors where that entry point, say, is being continued. So if it's an education program, maybe there was, like in the case, there's a case from the GPSA that Flor and Tom recently evaluated, where the GPSA had started developing a protocol, but afterwards, you know, many years later, there was other programs and key staff within that program that continued that work. So I guess in setting priority outcomes, it's looking at like what is realistic in the time frame for the context, and looking at where those intermediary outcomes along that causal pathway can happen. So questions that David brought up, like, was there other things before it that could contribute to this, or is it starting from a pilot phase? You know, who is involved? Is there time in the project and capacity dedicated to bringing key people in and engaging with them along the way? And so I think it sometimes takes a little bit of detective work, because that's not always going to look the same. So it's not always going to be that, you know, people have expressed publicly that they're going to continue with this program or that it's embedded into policies or institutions yet. It might be through a lot of background discussions, continued engagement. So if you're evaluating a program, like, what are those signs? Was there an effort by the program to look at entry points, identify actors who could really be brought in, and providing incentives for interest, entry points, how that could help in their own strategic aims and their own, you know, aims for their communities. So I think that the rubric gives us a framework from avoiding that, you know, 0 to all or nothing inclination, and often unrealistic timeframes and expectations for scale in very challenging contexts.
Thanks, Alex. Before handing over to Tom, I think on this issue that it's popping up in the chat and what you're and that Alex is mentioning, I think there's one of the challenges is this: how do we avoid unrealistic expectations? But also, if we're looking at the contribution of thinking and working politically to relevant outcomes, it may very well be the case that in a certain context or portfolio, we have places where we want to try to move up the chain, but thinking politically in another context, success may be just keeping bad change at bay, right? So especially when we're working with a lot of programs on issues of, for example, civic space closure or others, where it's the good outcome. It's really not a linearly positive one, but rather avoiding negative reversals, right? Or those implications. And so that challenges us not to combine that tacit knowledge that I think Soren was mentioning in the chat, with understanding what that makes sense in this context, and how do we fit it to the monitoring evaluation, the formal one that we're doing. And so it's interesting to see organizations that might be experimenting with those, for example, using mid-level evaluation and the like. So I'll pass it back to Tom.
Thanks, Flor, and appreciate the comments in the chat that we're following and processing. I think that there is an interesting dynamic here around who sets expectations and where that should sit and how realistic things are. I was talking to several colleagues recently about a highly conflict-affected state, and where there's this enormous disjunct between what the donor is expecting in an ideal world and what is actually deliverable in practice. And I think that one of the things that maybe TWP helps us to do is to reflect on that realism and on, you know, the dynamics at play when people make decisions about this. And so I think that's worth considering. Another point that we wanted to have a look at, and we've got a few speakers to share with us on this, is on sort of methodological developments that people have to respond to this. And as Flor said at the beginning, it's not just a matter of methodology insofar as that there are good ones and bad ones, but about combining different parts of methods that allow us to, and analyses that allow us to draw insights out of the experience. And we had, for instance, several, dozen political economy analyses in the Pearl program in Nigeria. The question was, when was the most useful time to use them, and what were the bits of those insights that could be used, and how well could they be used? And at the same time, we had issues in terms of donor reporting, which was obviously a challenge throughout, and lots of programs that many of you will be involved in might have similar challenges. We have also quite different resources available to us in different programs. Some programs are enormous, some programs are tiny. And it's interesting to think about, what is the right fit of methods and tools for different purposes. And what we wanted to do now was to bring in a few colleagues to discuss how they have addressed some of the methodological challenges in combining different tools and approaches that sort of fit with this politically informed, flexible, and adaptive approach. So I wanted to maybe bring in Nikki Wood, who's at Integrity Global, just to kick us off on that discussion. And then I think what we can do is we can maybe open it up to a few more folks in the group beyond those that we've identified as having something to share, and then we can add some more examples from the folks we've identified. Does that sound okay? Nikki, can you give us a bit of a sense of how you've addressed the method challenge in trying to respond to this in sort of smaller or larger programs in your experience?
Absolutely. So I'm going to speak to an example that is more of a MEL framework that was accompanying a program that was trying to really think and work politically. And specifically, we were interested in to what degree is the program team actually applying thinking and working politically in the way they were working, and then how is that contributing to observed changes that emerged. And the first thing that was really essential to the way that we tackled this was to create an appropriate guiding frame for what do we mean when we say the team is thinking and working politically. For us, this was in the context of the Western Balkans, lots of different countries, different institutional scenarios. And it's interesting that both David and Alec commented on rubrics, because that was actually something that we found incredibly helpful. The application of TWP is non-binary, it is intangible, but a participatory collective development of what are the different degrees between not thinking, working politically at all and applying it in a manner that's completely appropriate within these contexts was essential to create that rubric as a guiding frame, allowed us to judge what are we doing, what are we not doing, how can we be leaning into these principles more. Once we had that guiding frame in place, there was a suite of tools and methods that we found incredibly useful to both articulate whether the team was in fact applying this and then trace it through to how it contributed to the observed changes. A lot of these revolved around the fact that the kinds of changes that come out of institutional strengthening programs, that was our context, and the kinds of applications of TWP are hugely intangible. They often happen in meeting rooms, they get forgotten about, the quarterly report comes around and it's a scramble. We developed some observational evidence tools that captured those incredibly intangible changes in language, the way you made connections, the way you expanded relationships that can be quite difficult to pinpoint in a moment. So formalized observational evidence that was easy to use was very important. We also drew on discursive and participatory methods. We would engage in adapted forms of before and after action reviews with the program team to make sure we were capturing their applications of TWP and any potential results that could have had. We also drew on typical evaluative practice methods to try to triangulate that as a third party around it as well. And all of these came together to give us an evidence base that could help us say, together, are we actually thinking and working politically or not? What elements are we doing well? What elements are we doing less well? where can we be shifting our approach? And then when change emerged, we had a suite of evidence to pull across as a contribution chain to say, this emerged because we applied those principles. This institution has shifted from being an individual to being an institution because of the way this team has worked. Articulating that in the form of a contribution story, like contribution analysis might produce, is incredibly powerful. But what was even more powerful was the participatory contribution mechanism. Tom, we actually used your rubrics in it and brought everybody around the table to discuss, do we actually believe the evidence is plausible? Is it meaningful enough to tell us that thinking and working politically contributed to this outcome? And do we all agree on the level of contribution the different aspects had to this observed element? Participatory mechanisms can be quite difficult. It requires a lot of time. It pulls people around a table, but making sense of these concepts with guiding frames has been absolutely integral.
Thanks so much, Nikki. And one of the reasons I wanted to call on Nikki was I knew that there'd been some previous work with things that I'd worked on, but that represented limitations of what I'd done, things that other people had interpreted differently about how I'd defined things and how I had misdefined them or I'd got them wrong, right? So I think part of what I wanted to have communicated there is also that these are discussions about what we value, at what level. And as Nikki says, a lot of this should be more open to discussion, should be more participatory. Very often we have barriers to participation because of the strictures and the structures that we have. But this is a space where, particularly where if your concepts are not particularly clear, you need to discuss what you mean. And I wanted to actually just bring in one other colleague briefly now, who is a little bit ahead of schedule, Jorge. I'm not sure if that's okay, because we had a discussion yesterday about concepts like inclusive governance, which obviously cuts across quite a lot of the thinking and working politically work. And in a similar light of sort of critique of stuff that might have come from outside or from other people, I wondered if you're with us, Jorge, if you could give us a quick sense of your take on some of this. And I think the reason I wanted to bring in Jorge in part is also because it's a pretty small project with limited budgets, and we're having to make decisions and choices more or less every day about how we can best make use of resources and expertise and skills. But Jorge can tell us a bit more about where you started from, some of the analysis that you did, and how you see M&E or MEL fitting into the plans that you have in Colombia.
Yes, just to avoid giving context on the project, you can see all the links that I added there, the political economy analysis that we did, and some blogs. Basically, we're working to support the implementation of energy communities in Colombia. And we based that decision in a political economy analysis that was began entering to understand the context of the energy transition in Colombia, and then go to the feasible and impactful entry points for the Governance Action Hub, and as Tom says, for the small team and the small program that we are. And we have used that continuously. So I just wanted to share like 5 ideas or a couple of ideas. One is that we did that PEA. It was great. It enabled us to identify this entry point, but we are continuously leaving the political economy analysis because, as others have said, there is a ton of informal information coming. There is a ton of changes in the context. And we are also realizing that as we go from the national level to the local level, especially in a clientelist political settlement like in Colombia, things change a lot. And we need to be aware of the distribution and the incentives and the political dynamics at the local level and how to navigate those. So that's very important. And we kind of keep a space in our meetings and the meetings with partners implementing in regions to discuss these changes and what those mean to a program and how can we respond to that. Another thing is that we are also using a systems thinking approach. So we are very aware of, given that we are small, our main contribution is to add value to the work of partners and to try to make those connections that can increase the results of the program. So that's really good, but that requires a very strong knowledge management, as Soren was pointing at the beginning. because there are many relationships, there are many opportunities, there are many challenges that we are identifying and nudging relationships around them. So understanding how the system is and how the system works around particular issues. For instance, we just did a systems mapping of all the research most of the research initiatives around energy communities, and are now using that to identify issues to promote collaboration and to strengthen efforts or pilots to contribute to the national policy. Then, well, that brings another thing, and is that a ton of that work on making the connections and ensuring that collaboration advance and we are adding value to them, also makes it really important to have like flexible ways to identify your contribution to impact and the impact that those, or the things that those collaborations contribute to. So what we are beginning to do is, well, we have been using a learning log as the initial or the base for the monitoring, evaluation, and learning. But right now we're moving into using 4 different types of things. One is categories for being able to collect and manage all this information, having indicators that allow us to see if we are progressing towards what we want, but also to identify key instances to use continuously outcome harvesting to be able to identify why and how we were able to make things happen and what things are those instances leading to. The other one is rubrics, especially for the engagement with local communities, where we want to see very specific changes, or not specific, but changes in several categories in a community, so they are able to leverage this access to energy for local development. So we are developing those rubrics, and we'll use them to baseline and continuously monitor until the end of the engagement with those communities. We are also trying to, or exploring how to use systems maps in a dynamic way to kind of understand how the system is shifting and how we need to position ourselves in the system to add more value to the issues. And finally, one important point is that we are really about locally led development. So we have, for instance, in a pilot that we are developing in La Guajira, we did a module, a training, and at the beginning of that to exchange capacities with partners. So we have been bringing all the political economy and the monitoring, evaluation, and learning conversations, so they are the ones that can use it in that program in collaboration with us. Also trying to make the most of the limited resources that we have. And they also taught us a ton of things about how to engage with indigenous communities in the region, about the local context, about the technical aspects of this work. So I will say just that it's important to think about all of this and how we use it, but also how we make others believers and users of this approach. So it doesn't matter if we need to drop off work on a region or focus on another one, they can continue doing this and they can continue advancing towards increased impact. And I hope that's useful, Tom.
Thanks so much, Jorge. It's helpful. And it also hopefully gives a sense of how dynamic the process is in terms of how we need to fit stuff together, move stuff in, move stuff out. I was thinking of movable type as my metaphor, in a sense. So it's, but I thought it was a good case of where, you know, a lot of this thinking is happening now, and we're having to make particular choices that might be informative to others. We've got a couple more people we want to bring in. So I'm just going to bring in one more person, then we have another 2 people to come in the final bit of the session. So I wanted to see if I could bring in Michael Moses now, please, for Encompass, if you're with us. Can't see you, but I think you're on the list somewhere.
Yep, I'm here.
To give us, well, partly your thoughts on the leading question that we had about mixing methods, but if you've had any further reflections as well on what people have been discussing, that's also very welcome. Over to you, Michael.
Cool. Yeah, thanks, Tom, and thanks, everybody. Really nice to see folks on the call, new faces and old. So I think a lot of what I was planning to talk about various folks have already hit on important points, and there's a lot of energy in the chat around, as Jorge was just framing it, I think locally led development and really making sure that the work that's being done, even with a TWP lens, or maybe especially with the TWP lens, is really reflecting and providing space for the perspectives and insights of folks who are most proximate to the kinds of problems that oftentimes we're trying to address in international development programs. So I think if we are thinking about tools and approaches and methods that are useful in a thinking, working politically context for programs that are trying to take that kind of approach, I found it really helpful to first start by thinking about lenses, then using lenses to cascade down to principles. And then once you have those elements in place, can help you really think about the sorts of tools that and approaches that are going to be useful in terms of supporting the kind of local leadership and action and learning and adaptation that is really helpful when we're trying to engage with complex systems. So just really quickly, we've talked a lot, obviously, about thinking, working politically today. It's the focus of our conversation. I find it helpful to think and to treat TWP as a lens as opposed to a practice, if that makes sense. It is a cross-cutting kind of lens that we can apply to all the work that we're doing in terms of strategy and learning and evaluation. A couple of other lenses that I think are useful and that I've applied in a specific context that I'll speak to in just a moment when we get to methods, are thinking about appreciative inquiries, really trying to draw on strengths in a particular program or context and use those as building blocks for figuring out what to do next. And then finally, treating learning as something that is emergent and that is really equipping folks to continuously iterate and navigate those complex systems over time. I think is really useful. So if we take those lenses, we can think about a couple of principles that flow from them. So I think the most important one is that really, for me, strategy and learning, and I think probably for a lot of you as well, strategy and learning, strategy and evaluation, these are two sides of the same coin. They are integrated processes that if we're serious about systems change, if we're serious about local leadership and action, really making sure that our strategy and our evaluation processes are as integrated as possible, and they're going to be able to drive learning and action and adaptation over time is really important. So if we keep that principle in mind, and then finally, again, really try and privilege the learning and action needs of partners and teams that are most proximate to the problems that we're trying to address, then I think that puts us in a place where we can look at a whole suite of different methods, do that in a way where we're partnering with those folks who are most proximate to problems, and together select the kinds of methods and use cases that are going to help everybody involved with this particular initiative really have a collective line of sight about what our understanding of causal pathways is in this system, and to track whether and how power dynamics are shifting over time, what entry points might be, and things like that. So with all of that in mind, just very briefly, over the past few years, I have worked on a program that involves a big global foundation with 70+ grantees who are working across Nigeria. It's a social accountability program. Got lots of Nigeria examples today, it seems like. And through that work, we have worked with grantees and with the foundation to select several different approaches that we've then adapted and applied to sort of drive this iterative action learning process throughout the course of program implementation, all of which have that sort of TWP lens, the other lenses I mentioned, and are really about trying to equip the strategy and the overall program such that folks are able to learn and take action together from emerging evidence over time. So we've used participatory systems mapping approaches. We have adapted and applied outcome mapping in a variety of contexts. We also have used rubrics, as many other folks have mentioned today. I can speak more about that later if that's helpful. And lots of other methods. But I think the overarching point and the most important thing that I want to emphasize is that it's not really, at least in my experience, not the tools that we use that are most important. It's, of course, how we use them and how we're able to bring folks together. And here I'm speaking from an evaluation or a strategy and evaluation perspective. I see my job and my team's job as being primarily to help bring, again, those folks who are most proximate to problems together, and to bring evidence that's emerging about our understanding of causal pathways, about the broader system and what's changing in that context. Bring them together to make sense of that evidence, to identify emerging lessons and challenges together, and then to collectively figure out, great, what's our line of sight for continuing to move towards the goals that we have in this complex system? How can we continue shaping power dynamics and adapt accordingly over time? I will pause there.
Over to you, Flo.
Oh, just wanted now, I mean, I see a lot of people in the chat, and just wanted to know if anyone wanted to open their mic and share thoughts, reflections of that exchange in the chat.
There were a couple of hands up that are now down, so we're just sort of checking on whether or not anyone has anything burning or anything that they wanted to come in. No, Arnaldo, we still have some more time. So we've got another cohort which we wanted to bring in. So it's we've got another 30 minutes. But we wanted to make sure that we had an opportunity, if anyone had anything burning that they wanted to come in, that they have the opportunity to do so. If no one does, then we can move on to that, and then we can open up the discussion towards the end. Alina has a raised hand.
I'm
you allowed to do that, Alina?
I don't know. I just was following a lot of the chat that have been commenting there, so hopefully it has been helpful. But I did want to raise an issue, taking advantage of the people who are on this call, because I think it's something that is that has been a lot in my mind, and also people like Tom, whom I have worked closely on this. But one of the things that Tom and I discussed at length when we were involved in the FCDO funded partnership in Pearl Initiative in Nigeria, and I think Steve Fraser is on the call, as well as others who have been involved in that program, is that there was a real challenge in embedding learning in M&E, because that created incentives to limit learning to what Tom has called single loop learning, or just sort of learning about what you're doing and, tick boxing a little bit, and then not going much more deeply into how and why you're doing what you're doing. Testing theories of change, I have seen that in the chat a lot. I think David was commenting on it. And it does seem to be the case that in this space of MEL and learning and adaptation, there's a lot that international actors have done to adapt their programs, but only at that more superficial layer, and not in terms of providing actual space for testing assumptions about how change happens, testing theories of change, and then if the theory of change does not hold, actually coming up with something else. I think there's a lot less space for that. And I don't know if what I'm asking is an unrealistic way of thinking about learning, but it does seem to me that just focusing on the what for a program is not sufficiently profound in terms of learning to be properly anchored in TWP principles. I hope that makes sense.
Got Juliana. Hands up. Do you want to come in?
Hi. Yeah, hi, can you hear me? Sorry, I don't know how to do my camera on. Anyway, I just wanted to respond to Alina. I work for SCDO in Nigeria at the moment. So I'm actually dealing with Pearl's successor program. And we had a meeting today with our team on our results framework and theory of change for the new program that learns from Pearl. And one of the decisions we took today was that we would include actionable learning as a performance area in the results framework of the new program. And this will be part of the annual review of the new program, meaning that actually the program will be incentivized and rewarded for evidence of deep learning. So Alina, I completely agree with your observation. Just to say that we're building on what we've learned, and this next iteration will hopefully give our suppliers more space to learn and reflect, and us as well together. Thank you. Over.
Thank you. That's interesting. It's an interesting connection. Before going to Kathy, also involved in Pearl, and Steve, if they want to jump in. I just want to say that sometimes what I feel uncomfortable with is the dichotomy, the assuming that one thing is not possible with the other. I when you were mentioning this, I remember Lily Tai and I put on a World Bank results framework around 2013, 2014. An indicator that was like, can the organization show that they've course corrected based on what they learn, or based on, and then we counted it into our results framework. So it's not, to me, it's not either or. Yeah, I mean, what was really hard in that case was really creating the incentives for the organizations to believe that we were actually asking about learning, as opposed to telling us how many people they have trained. And that took a lot of work, much more than putting it in the results framework and sort of like counting it and trying to marry sort of like what we want with what we have to do. And so I personally think that a lot of the most creative work that we've heard about today and that colleagues are doing is work that it's kind of like trying to kind of like find the way around the system rather than just kind of like fight against that. You know, it's sort of like, it's a lot of the creativity and the bricolaging, it's happening in that space of like, okay, I need to make this fit in a system that is imperfect. But hey, that's TWP brought to how we do M&E to some extent, is how we navigate and fit the organizational system, and to some extent. Tom, do you want to jump in before we
I want to
go
make a brief counterpoint to that, which is I think that's generally true, but there are some things that are so problematic and so damaging that they get in the way of everything else. And I think that payment by results is one of those things. And a lot of the cost effectiveness agenda as well is in a similar line that is wasting tremendous amounts of time. So I guess my question back to the FCDO Nigeria team would be, have you got rid of payment by results and have just added, let's do some more learning, which the team is more likely to be keen on, or do they still have to do payment by results and bend the knee to East Kilbride? Because if
now you're bringing the big toys out, Tom.
Yeah, but I mean, really, like but I think this comes back to some of the points that were being made, or the critiques that were being made at the beginning of this session, which we are listening to and hopefully taking seriously. This is about power and who has it in a program and where they sit, who makes decisions. And there are clearly some more flexible and amenable and reasonable people within donor agencies. Some of them are on the call. But there are things that even within those donor agencies, it's difficult for them to change. So I don't know if, Julie, you had a thought on payment by results as
Sorry,
there's
Julie, but I also just want to point that we have Deidre who wanted to chime in and couldn't raise her hand. So, to avoid this making like sort of like making sure that everyone speaks. So Julie, do you want to go, and then we go to the.
Yeah, sure. I'll go very quickly so I don't, our dialogue doesn't dominate the conversation. Just to say, Tom, our successor program does not have any payment by results. On the contrary, it has an incentive mechanism, actually, quite the opposite. So learning's happening within donor agencies as well. Thank you.
That's great news. Happy to hear that.
So we go to, yeah, I mean, we're gonna go back to Kathy and more Nigeria, but I don't want this to make it about Nigeria only. So, Deidre, do you wanted to jump in?
Yeah, thank you very much, Flo. I think maybe I'm just taking people back now because somehow the discussion is really much of a fishbone, isn't it? I wanted to just go back to what Tom you said about mixing methods. Which I think for the work that I do, I work for CAFOD, the Catholic Aid for Overseas Development, and I'm a governance advisor there. And some of the things that we've seen with TWP is that if you want it to really work, you need to scaffold it. So we have tried to kind of enhance it more by making sure we have other approaches that go together with it. So one of the things we've been trying, and maybe later on I would talk about the results, is the critical learning questions. So asking then each kind of like country offices to then look at some of the critical learning questions around what do they call TWP and how are they doing it, and so that helps them at least to monitor that as they go along to see whether they're following that. But also one of the things we've done is also kind of doing the ABC, which is the actor-based change maps. So trying to make sure that people do that, because when they're doing it, they're not really thinking that it's about TWP per se. They're just doing it as part of their usual stakeholder analysis, but then trying then to make sure that when they have those maps, how do they then link to the thinking, working politically? And what I can say about the monitoring is that it's very hard. So what we are trying to do is say, can that sit along the results framework for a minute, so that they can just refer to it in terms of, well, maybe what this actor did would speak to outcome 1 or outcome 2. So basically is how do you make them work together with the results framework than kind of making it just a standalone approach of the TWP monitoring, as it were.
Super, thanks so much. Love the term scaffolding. I'm going to steal that and credit you for it, Deidre. Floor.
Yeah, so I've been exchanging some provocations here, but before we go there, I just want to bring Kathy and Steve if they want to share about so that we don't lose the last thread of the value for money and best buys and what you guys have been doing in terms of sort of like thinking and working politically around those issues and trying to change the conversation work with.
Oh, I don't know what we're speaking to exactly. We're speaking to your question. I've got other experiences to share on putting the learning and double loop learning in a performance matrix that Alina was speaking to, and it didn't go well. But I'm not talking about that now. We were just talking on the Pearl experience, and this is a bit more instrumental. We've been looking to make the case for thinking and working politically programs and adaptive management. So I'm speaking on behalf of other people that couldn't make it, and I'm just going to be brief and say that I think there have been some advances in doing that instrumental stuff, even though it's quite difficult in terms of making a case that a thinking and working politically approach works more effectively than working in other ways. But we haven't necessarily been as good at learning how some of that thinking and working politically, taking decisions based on political economy analysis has worked in practice. So the experience comes off a PMAL commissioned piece of work, which Juliana can speak to, by FCDO Nigeria, which was commissioned because it basically found that although some of the value for money and MEL work that we've been doing internally in Pearl, which was showing that political economy analysis had led to certain decisions which saved X many thousands of pounds, decisions to not engage part of the system where there would be no traction, for example, at national level or move to local level, and to make a plausible case for why that would allow FCDO resources to go further. Subsequently, FCDO commissioned this more qualitative piece of work to really explore how thinking and working politically and adapting had improved the effectiveness. And I think the findings which OPM hopefully will share was that this had definitely worked well, but been confounded by the performance-based payment by results frameworks that Tom was talking to, and can elaborate more on more. But I think what we've reflected on really is that despite this, and this is what the PMAL group found when they came in, they weren't able to access some of the experiences that, or some of the evidence that Nikki was talking about how people had made these everyday decisions. And our sort of questions, that some of the reflections Steve and I were having was sort of why is that difficult, and is it necessary? I mean, obviously it's very important for us to document, and some of the experience with both Mozambique and Pearl around whether, you know, the difficulties, the challenges that people have making these decisions. Last week we had a seminar from the on the Potentia program in Mozambique, and we reflected that this whole kind of fail fast idea that you can just break up relationships because something's not working is really problematic. Relationships and systems work. What do we do about that? Labena from Pearl was remarking to me this morning, you know, it's really hard. How do you make strategic decisions? Is it about withdrawing from interventions or changing strategy? And these are the kinds of things that aren't documented. And Steve is going to explain why some of them aren't and the challenges, but I think it raises questions about should they be and for whom if they are, which is around the decolonization agenda. Steve, are you there?
I am, Kathy. Hi, Flo. Hi, Tom. Hi, everyone. Yeah, just to continue where Kathy's left off. I think on the Pearl program. Hi, Alina. Yeah, on the Pearl program, I mean, it's been a large program with a lot of subnational teams working very closely with local partners and taking a really locally led approach. And I think for a lot of the delivery teams, keeping a record of sort of every decision that they make on every intervention, given that many of them are sort of engaged in political economy analysis and working politically on a continuous basis, working with those partners, particularly among I mean, both government and non-state partners, trying to find, you know, the best routes, the individuals to work with and the strategies to take with them. It's a continuous process. They don't have the luxury of time to sit down and record every decision that they take on a continuous basis. So you don't have real-time data or evidence generation. It tends to happen when you, in retrospect, whether on a quarterly or an annual basis, you're looking at some of the results they've achieved against their targets in their results frameworks and trying to analyze how they came to achieve those results, and looking at their sort of a bit of contribution analysis. And it's through that you then start to analyze and bring out the sort of their use of thinking and working politically, how that's actually helped them to achieve some of those results with their partners. So it's not something that you can really document and evidence in real time. And again, given that a lot of the delivery teams are working full time with those partners on this, you know, they don't have the appetite to do a lot of that reporting. It takes quite an investment of some of the staff from the national team, and supported by consortium partners to actually spend time with them analyzing those results and how they contributed to them, to really bring out the use of thinking and working politically, and how some of the decisions they've taken to you know, drop this activity, shift from one intervention more attention to another. It takes time, so it tends to be something that comes out through reporting systems on a quarterly or annual basis. And just to pick up that point you were making earlier about you know, building this into a results framework, actionable learning. Yeah, Juliana was saying that there is still a tension within teams in terms of the purpose of learning as to whether that's about proving or whether it's about improving. And I think once you start setting indicators for learning, you know, we've got a lot of experience of trying to demonstrate actionable learning and where things haven't worked or where things have, how that learning has helped that. But it does tend to set up a bit of competition within the program between development of learning products, things that can prove that you've used thinking and working politically or political lens to achieve something, and actual reflection and learning for planning processes. And often those planning processes are with local partners, they're with staff, that it's not necessarily about documenting and capturing the learning. It's about what then goes into their thinking and what goes into their planning of their next steps. So there's a bit of tension between those two. And if not enough resources are invested in both of those, one tends to win out, and it tends to favor that requirement of reporting against a results framework. But we managed to strike a healthy balance on Pearl. Nabena's testament to that. I've seen that tension on other programs that hasn't resolved it, and they're still infighting, trying to, is this learning for proving or learning for improving? So it's a balance that needs to be carefully found. Thanks.
Okay, so for a few minutes left, I just wanted to ask, and I don't want to put Santiago on the spotlight, but Santiago, did you want to say anything? Good either way, but
Okay. Hi, Florencia, and hi everyone. This was great, and this is my first time actually taking part of this, and I'm learning a lot of what you're saying. So yeah, I think I have some comments, and I think like I want to echo some of the things that Michael said, and also Drew and Soren as well. So Michael at some point mentioned it's not about the tools, it's about how we use them. And then Soren and Drew also mentioned that we don't want to have like political economy analysis as just a standalone like product, but also, something else. And I think that actually speaks to the main challenge I think that we have in our jobs, which is, going beyond the diagnosis and thinking about in terms of action. And that basically, I think, assumes or needs that we do research in a different way. And I think, like we need to like think about how we can work more collaboratively with local communities and what we need to actually achieve change. And that means, actually asking them what change means. I think you mentioned something like this, Florencia, as well. And so it's not just about like talking with donors and, like having these assumptions beforehand, but also talk to them, have like more knowledge of local context, of local circumstances, get new data so we can actually can achieve effective change. And so, yeah, I think that is what I have in my mind.
sounds great. Do you want to wrap up? I think we're just in time, and then we'll take it from there.
Great. So thanks so much to everyone for contributing. We've still got a pretty large cohort, despite the fact that we've taken about 90 minutes of your time. So very appreciative of everyone still being here and the energy in the chat that we've been trying our best to keep up with as well. I think that there's several things that we're going to wrap up in writing from this session. So we've still got to go and look at what the dynamics are here. But I think there's a few key points probably that seem to be emerging, at least for me at this point, and I just wanted to share maybe a couple of those. And some of these are new, and some of these are slightly older but are maturing. There's clearly this general point around how we integrate political economy analysis in practice and in a way that's actionable, that a lot of people are struggling with and trying to find agile ways to do it. Some of that might be the heaviness of political economy analysis and how long it takes and how much of it can be public and how much of it can be private. But there's still struggles of finding ways to include it in a way that's actionable. And I think some of that is about its agility, or using elements or bits of it and perhaps using it in a more informal way. And bleeding that through. One example of that was the COM-B work, so the capabilities, opportunities, and motivation stuff, which is doing similar things on political economy, but in sort of health behavior change language. So it's sort of smuggled in as a way of thinking through part of this stuff, perhaps in not as much depth, but nonetheless, I think it's important. Another point that was discussed was around the potential interdependencies between TWP and CLA. It's obviously a very USAID conversation, but at the same time, I think that what I was hearing was that TWP is arguably just a deeper form, which has an extra few layers to what CLA is trying to do. I remember talking once to a colleague, Craig Walters, as to why it was that CLA sort of was easier for people to digest than some of the TWP stuff some years ago. And I think some of that is because of its perceived political sensitivity and people's cautions around the word politics and things like that. But I think that people have found more mature ways in recent years to at least partially address some of the concerns. And it's encouraging, I think, that people have seen the competition as a platform to think about things in a slightly different way, but not in a way that's inconsistent with the CLA stuff, which I think mostly people think is positive and helpful. There were several other concerns or comments or queries, I think, around who's setting the agenda of what we monitor and measure. There's the age-old conversation about should we have log frames or not, and how light or how tight that they should be. I'm very encouraged to hear that a program that I used to work on no longer has a payment by results framework. So that's, I think, enormous progress for me in terms of what really impeded that program from working more effectively. But I would take Flore's point as well, which is that it's not necessarily an either or option. You can have some indicators and you can have some performance measures alongside a looser and more open approach. Arnaldo made a point in the comments, which was that not having a log frame potentially liberates you, and that's something I can believe, but it doesn't have to be an albatross or an anchor necessarily in extremis. And in the case that Jorge presented, there's about a dozen quantitative performance measures because the team wanted some quantitative data to show. It wasn't that they absolutely need to, but that they felt that it was in some way, they feel, because I think this is a still evolving conversation, they feel that it is of some use to them. And so it doesn't necessarily have to be a zero-sum game, but there are perhaps some extreme cases here. There's another point here about mixing methodologies. I really liked Daddy Rai's point about scaffolding, how you build the appropriate methods and tools atop other things. So how you bolt on political economy analysis or aspects of it or forms of it is something for us to consider. The same applies to some of the methods and tools for M&E that we use. Probably perhaps too many people use the word rubrics. I'm an absolute fan of rubrics as well. But it is something which I think illustrates how we need some structure, but perhaps not too structure sometimes with this kind of things. And rubrics is something which is pretty amenable to that because the language you use is quite versatile. The number of levels you consider, the performance measures you use can be quite versatile. And that's why I think Alex's case or Nikki's case, and I think Michael mentioned this as well, are illustrating some similar trends there. But there were lots of other methods that people mentioned as well, such as outcome mapping, contribution analysis and other things. And there were some comments in the chat as to, whether people could share those methods directly. And it may well be that those are reinterpretations of or adaptations of those methods rather than the methods in full, which is something that I've certainly learned myself as well, how you can mix and choose parts of methods that you find most suitable for your purposes, and make sure, as I think also Michael has said, that what we're trying to do as much as possible is reflect the realities of the people doing the work. It's very easy for us to look at this through the lens of expertise, but a lot of this is about making sure we can make the use of people's knowledge and contextually grounded understanding and the political sensitivities that we work with. One key part of that is that things go forwards and things go backwards, and that's something that I think really hasn't been given enough light. There are some things out there from ORS impact on change blocking and other things like that maybe people can explore, but it's something that I think we have to take more seriously. And another thing that we thought from this experience was that we also have to be realistic about what levels of change are actually possible in different contexts, and make sure that context is at the heart of whatever it is that we're doing, because that ultimately, I think, at least from my perspective, is at the heart of what TWP is about, whichever methods, tools, approaches you actually end up using. That would be my brief summary. Hopefully captures many of the things that we've discussed, but we've committed to write some of this up for the TWP community of practice, and we look forward to sharing that with you later. So thank you so much, everybody, for your contributions. Really, really valued. Lots for us still to process, but you know, really grateful for what you've been able to share. And I can see still lots of comments and questions in the chat, but I'm going to pass back over to Alina to close us out. And apologies that we're 1 minute over.
Thank you so much again, Flor and Tom, for facilitating this fishbowl. I really enjoyed being part of this conversation. I think it was an extremely enriching set of comments that we got from all sorts of people. And again, it was really lovely to see so many familiar faces and also get to meet new ones. There's a very rich chat, and hopefully this conversation in the chat will be reflected in what Flor and Tom produced for us. And if there are questions about methodologies and all of that you have, I saw the last one from Lisa McGregor, please do drop us a line, because there's a lot of stuff out there. Jamie Pett, I was saying, has written a very useful overview of all sorts of different approaches and how they relate to one another. Something called Navigating Complexity, I believe. It's an ODI working paper that he did as part of the Learn Adapt program. Before I leave you, I am going to try this as an experiment. I have posted a link to a Menti word cloud, which has a question for all of you, where you just have to sort of say a couple of words that come to mind from what you take away from this discussion, which then will be very helpful for us to sort of see if we hit a nerve and how else we can continue to engage with all of you. So there's the link. It is live, and we hopefully can include it in as part of the report that Flora and Tom will be putting together. But thank you to everybody, and I also want to acknowledge my colleague Tandy, who has been helping madly behind the scenes with everything from setting us up here to managing the chat to ensuring that people who wanted to speak can speak. So thank you so much, Tandy, and everybody. Take care.
Hey, everyone.